Hi, I'd like to invite you to join us for our next session in Scarecrow Academy's ongoing semester, The Art in Horror, Horror and the Director, in which we've been looking at the horror genre through the perspective of what a film director does. My name is Robert Horton. I'm a member of the National Society of Film Critics, and I'm a board member at the nonprofit Scarecrow Video. And I've been guiding the conversations that we've been having around this topic. Our next film is Let the Right One In, and our Zoom discussion will take place on Saturday, November 7th at 2 p.m. Pacific time. You can register for that by looking for the appropriate links on Scarecrow's Scarecrow Academy page and signing up, and you can join us through Zoom when you do that. We've highlighted some of the greatest directors in film history for this semester of Scarecrow Academy. But in our final weeks, we're going to be looking at a group of filmmakers who may be less well known, and in some cases are at the early stages of their careers, like Jordan Peele or Ari Aster. This week we are looking at the Swedish director Tomas Alfredson and his 2008 film Let the Right One In, as I said. And in this introduction, I'll say a little bit about Alfredson and suggest some of the ideas that we might talk about during our class session. Tomas Alfredson was actually a veteran filmmaker. He'd been in the business for about 20 years by the time of Let the Right One In, a movie that made his name internationally. His father had been a well-known Swedish comedian and later a straight dramatic actor as well and a filmmaker. His final movie was The Girl Who Kicked the Hornet's Nest, which was one of the 3 films that were made in Sweden that were adaptations of the celebrated Girl with the Dragon Tattoo literary trilogy. And as a matter of fact, 2 of those Swedish films were directed by Daniel Alfredson, the son of the actor and brother of Tomas Alfredson. So our director grew up in a filmmaking family, obviously. He worked quite a bit in Swedish television. He worked in kids' TV a bit and a lot of comedy, working with a comedy group in Sweden, not much of which got outside of Scandinavia, apparently. But Let the Right One In made quite an impression on the film festival circuit in 2008, and that's how Alfredson became more of an international figure. This movie is adapted from a novel by a Swedish writer named John Lindquist, who also wrote the screenplay. And Alfredson says that he did not have a special interest in horror or vampire lore or anything like that when he came to it, but he responded strongly to the theme of loneliness in the story. They cut some of the material, as people always do when they adapt a book into a movie. We might mention some of that during our session. But the most important thing they did was they took a year to find the right actors for the 2 lead roles. And anybody who has seen the film will, I think, agree that it's absolutely crucial that the 2 12-year-old actors, completely unknown at the time, are very important to what makes the movie work. I interviewed Gary Oldman a few years ago for Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, a movie that was directed by Tomas Alfredson, and we talked about the director and his fastidious attention to detail. I'm going to mention maybe a couple of anecdotes related to that during our session, but even if you're just watching Let the Right One In, I think you can see that this is a filmmaker who is very focused on concentrating on things, making them just so, from the 1980s, it's like early 1980s set design and costume design to the understanding that what you do with a frame and how you arrange action within it is crucial to how a scene turns out and why so many scenes in the film are so successful. So we'll talk about some examples of that, of Alfredson's very deliberate use of composition, color, lighting, sound as well. And this extends to the movie's very strong sense of place and how that affects our experience of this story. There are no Gothic castles, there are no Victorian mansions, there's no sweeping romance in this particular vampire story. We are in the suburbs of Stockholm, where the post-war housing impulse has created this community of sort of featureless buildings, kind of locked in place, anonymous tenements, little squares where children might go out and play by themselves in the middle of the winter. A vampire happens to have come here, and so that's why our story is set here. But we don't have any of the comforting trappings of old school vampire stories here. One of the early murder scenes, for instance, shows the young vampire's familiar, the older man who goes out and does the bidding of the vampire, and he's in a public park. There's all these birch trees around, weirdly flooded with light, with some kind of floodlights at night, I guess. Cars moving past in the background on a road in a kind of ordinary way. And you might be disturbed by the violence of what we see, but also sort of by the juxtaposition of these bland surroundings with, freaky ancient ritual suddenly. And as the film goes on, we might also notice how little the natural world comes into play in some of these sequences. So much of it's about the built environment, especially except for there's one day at the frozen lake nearby the suburb where horrible things happen nonetheless. Part of the director's art is tone, and it will be interesting to look at how Alfredson walks a fine line in this movie. It's a sad film, sometimes violent in a number of moments, and it has a wonderfully empathetic approach to its youthful protagonists, but it also carries an undercurrent of humor, I think. There's the satirical depiction of the people in this suburban housing block. They sometimes look like refugees from one of Aki Kaurismäki's satirical films from Finland. People who drink too much and smoke too much and get on each other's nerves. At times, even the movie's exercises in sort of Stephen King-like shock, and there are a half dozen of those or so. Those have a slight edge of the absurd to them. There is some kind of Scandinavian dark humor going on here, along with this emotional through line, which remains true between the two young people, which stays very strong and sad and culminates in a very memorable and very haunting final sequence. If you've seen the American remake of this film, Let Me In, which was released in 2010, perhaps we'll bring that film up as well. Quite against the tradition of Hollywood quickly cashing in on remakes of foreign films, this one actually turns out to be not bad at all. So that's Let the Right One In, a title that I think deserves to be considered among the best horror movies of the 21st century. We'll look forward to hearing from you about our Scarecrow Academy session on November 7th, and we invite you to join us for another meeting of the art in horror.